intimate there.
You're listening to Head South Radio with your host, Kat Meyer, a podcast dedicated to prioritizing pleasure and removing the stigma and shame around sex. We're here to be curious and have an open conversation about sexual health and relational wellness. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes. The information discussed is not a substitute for professional medical advice.
Hi everyone, I'm your host, Kat Meyer, and on this episode of Head South Radio, I speak with intimacy coach Valentin Somma. Valentin specializes in the internal family systems form of therapy, which is an evidence-based therapy approach that recognizes the multiplicity of the mind. He works closely with mostly cisgendered heterosexual men on self-compassion, consent, intimacy, vulnerability, and communication. When it comes to coaching men on consent, it is not just a question at the beginning of a sexual encounter and getting permission and you are done. Consent, like boundaries and emotions, are ever-changing. Consent is an ongoing conversation with partners around boundaries and exploration. Many believe the idea of consent can ruin the mood. Valentin works with men to hone in on their communication skills to provide continuous, healthy, and sexy consent. He also teaches them when and how they should have these types of conversations so as to not ruin the mood, and to allow all partners involved the safe space to express themselves fully, and then in turn experience the full breadth of their pleasure. We also touch on topics like masculinity, vulnerability, and intimacy. He shares his approach to working with clients on healing themselves, especially the parts they have been conditioned to believe are shameful, weak, and negative. And while during this conversation we focus the lens on a cisgendered heterosexual experience, a lot of what we discuss is universal regardless of gender or orientation. It would truly be appreciated and means a lot to me and helps Head South grow if after listening to this episode you leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Also, please share this episode with your partners, friends, and family on social media. Good morning.
Good morning.
Valentin, thank you for joining us on Head South Radio. I'm going to start with some icebreakers. And so just a few quick questions to get to know you. So do you prefer the East Coast or the West Coast?
Oh, it's tough. I like the life and the people I know on the East Coast a lot. But the weather on the West Coast is quite something.
Yeah, I agree with you fully. I am an East Coast girl at heart, and I love the people, the community. I love the seasons, but I could do a little less with winter. And the nature, the climate over in the West Coast is just incredible. And the microclimate, so the ability to experience so much nature within very small pockets is really lovely. Window or aisle seat?
Window.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee, for sure.
Cookies or brownies?
I think brownie.
Okay.
Or very chewy cookies, maybe.
Yeah.
Like very chewy.
Cookies that have a texture like a brownie.
Yeah,
Cats or dogs?
Same heart. I'm allergic to cats, so I'll say dogs.
Okay.
But I really like both.
Morning person or night person?
I also really like both, but it's really hard for me to wake up in the morning. So definitely night person.
What's your favorite sport to watch?
Sport. I don't really watch sports much. Sometimes soccer when the France is playing in the World Cup.
Yeah.
I guess dance.
Dance,
Not really
movement.
sport, but like, yeah.
Performance and movement. And,
Yeah.
Did you have pets growing up as a kid?
Nope.
What's your creative outlet?
Movement, dance, and music. I've been learning guitar and handpan for the last couple of years. Yeah.
Very cool. What's your favorite scent?
There's several things coming up. It's coffee, things like Palo Santo, like very yoga studio like. Yeah, I'll go with those two.
Okay. What song are you listening to on repeat?
Clandestina, acoustic version by Emma Peters. You might know like an EDM version of it. And that's the song that EDM version was based on.
Oh, cool. Okay, so tell us about your background, who you are, where you're from, and what you do.
Okay. So I'm Valentin. I'm French. In past lives, I got a Ph.D. in economics. I worked in management consulting. I've done a lot of very mainstream-looking things. And over the past few years, I slowly changed life. And what I offer today is both coaching around intimacy and using IFS, internal family systems, which is a therapy approach that I got trained in to help my clients build loving and compassionate relationships with all of the parts of themselves.
When we spoke briefly before our interview, I looked up IFS because you mentioned it, and I had never heard of this system. And it seems very fascinating, and it actually spoke to me a lot and made a lot of sense of like, we are multifaceted, and there are many parts of us that kind of represent how we express in the world and also our inner dialogues. Could you break that down a little bit more just to kind of distill what modality is?
Yeah. The main premise is we're all made of parts. And what we mean by that is simply who you are now when you talk to me is not who you are when you're teaching a yoga class. It's not necessarily who you're going to be with your partner or with your parents, right? Or maybe you ever considered a decision, whether that's a big one or just getting out of bed in the morning, and you're like, and you can feel inside of you that a part of you wants to do this and another part of you wants to do that, and you kind of witness that inner dialogue between those parts, right? And for some of us, some of those parts get stuck in overwhelming emotions or very compulsive behaviors, whether they're outside or inside of you. So it could be things like inside a very harsh inner critical voice, or outside something like reaching out for anything that's soothing, whether that's food, substances, or things like that, right? Or just the emotions themselves being very, very big, like big panic or shame or anger. And so when those parts get stuck in those things, it can be damaging to your life, to your well-being, to your relationships, etc. And so what IFS does is it helps you build loving and compassionate relationships with all of these parts so that they don't feel the need to take over as much anymore. And you feel like you have more space to decide consciously how to act. And it goes internally from the feeling of having all of those different parts screaming at each other and trying to pull in different directions, to that of them like sitting in a circle around the table and all deciding together where to go, what's best for you and your system, which is how we call the group of all your parts.
Oh, wow. Okay. So yeah, I see it as I'm a child of one of 7. And so I picture that of like all of these parts of us is like an internal family. So internal family systems make sense. And it's like for some of us, we have the maybe older sibling who's bossy and controlling and angry, and, you know, the middle child who's trying to get so much attention, and all of these different characters just within ourselves. And what I'm understanding is that then you kind of help acknowledge each of those parts. So it's not about suppressing them or, you know, punishing one part of yourself or hiding or allowing one part to kind of take the shine away from everybody else, but like everyone cohesively working together.
And what you the analogy you're using brings up a very interesting point about IFS, which is it really acknowledges the systemic dynamics between those. So we don't just do work with one part in isolation. We really try to understand why it's doing what it's doing and what it's afraid would happen if it doesn't, and who else it's working against or with to prevent what from happening. And as we build those relationships by acknowledging those systemic implications inside of you, eventually those parts themselves end up pointing you towards the wound that they're trying to protect. And then we can go there and heal that. And then the parts change roles. So like the one that was maybe overprotective, or let's assume maybe you have a shy part.
Yes, I do. We don't have to assume that. Yes.
Okay, cool. And you realize maybe getting curious about that shy part that is actually trying to prevent some form of shame from coming up from events in your childhood, things you've learned socially from other students at school or from your parents or things like that. And once we go there and heal that, then you realize that part that was trying to prevent you from going towards people now might be the very part of you that actually wants to encourage that. And similarly, an inner critic, like a very harsh critical voice, can become a cheerleader or a very discerning judge. They're kind of doing the same stuff at the end of the day, but instead of doing it overly negative, with big quotes, they do the positive, supportive version instead, or they do the neutral, very discerning one. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So you're working with these individual parts of each person and helping them change the narratives or the roles that they're playing. But they're still doing the same job that they're meant to be doing. Sometimes it's sounding the alarm, or sometimes it's, being more observant. So sometimes with my shyness, I I notice that as like, oh, it's just me being observant. And that's a neutral position rather than like, I'm shy and I'm scared.
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally understand how this modality would work and function and help people. So then with that, you work with all genders, all sexual orientations, all relationship styles.
Yes.
So thing from people who are monogamous as well as polyamorous, open and everything, all alternative relationships. We may focus explicitly on certain genders, but the information I want to just kind of disclose that the information we're going to talk about is for all people, regardless of their gender. But I wanted to kind of hone in a little bit on men, sex, masculinity, and vulnerability for this conversation.
Yeah. And most of my clients are cis men.
So what are more common issues that you are seeing in your male identifying clientele?
So usually they reach out to me because of something related to intimacy, right? Just because of how I market myself and what I help people with. And it's very often, okay, let me qualify one thing. I think because of who I am and what I talk about, the people who reach out to me probably self-select a little bit. So they tend to be men who have a habit of looking inside already, self-development, growth, however they call that, given their background, right? Like usually they have done that already in some form, and they are often facing challenges in romantic relationships around challenging emotions from childhood coming up in a way they don't fully understand. And sometimes an event triggered that. Sometimes it's always been there, and it's just that the current relationship they're in has them look at that deeper. And yeah, and so we just get curious about that for them and see where that comes from. And of course, because of the modality I use, we often try to trace that to everybody's early childhood, right? And it just comes up on its own. We're not trying to go there. And yeah, and around masculinity specifically, one thing that's interesting as well to notice is how not all, but some of those men have some ideal of what masculinity looks like. And you see that showing up sometimes in support of where they are and sometimes in tension. And usually that's more true with younger men, like men in their 30s. My older clients I see that less. I guess there's less of a, as I'm talking about it, I'm realizing there might just be less of a habit to question what masculinity means.
At that age, at that stage, maybe they're a little more grounded in their masculinity. And I wanted to add to that, I think where some of your clientele might be coming from is a place of uncertainty or seeing what the society society claims to be masculinity and them not fitting in that mold and then kind of feeling conflicted a little bit about that. Do you think that could be some of, or thinking in like toxic masculinity and then someone who maybe doesn't fit that mold might have some type of issues or concerns or conflict with intimacy because they don't feel like they fit that role?
So I don't really see, again, lots of self-selection, I think, in the people who reach out to me. But I don't see so much questioning or tension with toxic, what you would call toxic masculinity, right? It's much more things around, so one is vulnerability and like needing support or needing emotional support and closeness from a partner, and sometimes facing the partner's vision of what masculinity should be like, and whether that's okay for them to need so much care at times if they're going through very, very deep period of inner work, or if they have big challenges in the rest of their life. That's one. Another one around gender dynamics especially in dating and flirting and new connections. How to reconcile. And it's funny, it's always through the eyes of, it always comes up through the actual or perceived or expected reactions of partners or potential partners. And I'm talking only about cis heterosexual men right now. So yeah, a little bit of tension between, I want to seduce this person, and so I want to make sure I can appear as decisive, sure of myself, leading, right? Very much.
The attractiveness,
And at the same time being like, how do I hold that with practicing active consent, with asking them how they feel about things, because I really care about those stuff. And so just a little bit of interrogations around those tension as well. I think these are the two main, I'm sure there's more that would come up, but these are the two main themes that I've seen repeat themselves.
And so then that leads to my next question, because you kind of mentioned it. Do you mostly work with people who are single and struggling to find a partner, like in the dating scene, people who are in long-term relationships, maybe married for a long time, and they're kind of struggling and things have come up or things have built up, or maybe people going through breakup and divorce or transition, or all of the above?
I've had all of the above, and I think the ratio is close to equally split. Like my head is hard, but like I can see typical clients in all of the boxes you just mentioned.
Yeah.
In my head right now.
And what does masculinity mean to you, and how does it relate to intimacy and sexuality?
Oof. I wasn't expecting to be thrown under the bus. I thought I was talking about my clients.
Yeah.
This is a good one because it's something I have many different parts with many different views on that. On the one hand, there are the parts of me that realize how much of a construct gender is and how subjective that is, and how much it's just been shaped by my upbringing, my education, the world I live in. And I've had, through psychedelic experiences, felt sense of going back to a sense of identity that's even before being human, before being gender, having a gender and things like that. And so it's just like really wanting to embrace fully all of that work around deconstructing gender and thinking carefully about those questions without assuming some essentialism or stuff like that. And at the same time, I'm a cis man who tries to date cis women and so those questions just become very real through that lens, right? And what is masculinity to me? I don't even know how to start this one. I've never thought about it specifically as in for me. Like I always thought in a very intellectual, abstract sense.
Yeah, we'll let you percolate on that one because it is a bigger one and it is a curveball that I threw you. So let's sit on that and like see what comes up for you. But how do you help men develop emotional intelligence and vulnerability in their intimate relationships? So what are some exercises maybe that you would do with someone who is kind of struggling with being vulnerable in their intimate relationship?
So emotional intelligence and what was the other one?
Vulnerability.
So a lot of it is first helping people to look inside and be with what's here now for them, right? And getting them to explore what's coming up for them and what's the fear underneath, and just to even get a sense of what's happening and helping them downregulate if ever there's big emotions that are here, right? And then it's mostly around helping them articulate that and communicate that, getting clarity on first what they think they might need to communicate or might need to ask for, and then helping them bring that up with a partner, also helping them realize what the impact could be in advance of sharing this or that, asking this or that, right? To bring into the light any sense of making sure it's a request and not a demand. They want to ask for something, right? Realizing that the other person they're not entitled to that from the other person either. And communication it's not rocket science, right? At the end of the day, it's helping them apply little recipes on communication, something like, hey, there's something that I want to tell you about. I'm afraid you'd react is this. I would really like you to react to that. Do you have capacity to chat about that now? Cool. So when this, and then it's very, I'm sure you're familiar with nonviolent communication. And then those elements, like when this happened, I felt this way. I'm realizing it's connected to my need for this or that. Would you be open to doing this for me or doing something differently, talking more, blah, blah, blah. Right? Not rocket science, but sometimes just that exercise of helping someone look inside first and then brainstorm what they should be doing and then help them apply that in very, very basic steps in communicating that with partners. I mean, that's the whole thing, right? That's what vulnerability is like in practice. And what's really, really cool with people I've worked with for like months, sometimes over some clients that I've had for more than a year, they learn this, like you do it on something that comes up, but then they know how to do it. And so you really see that they keep that, all of those skills, whether that's the way of relating with their inner experience, the way of being with the people in their life. They keep that and then they propagate it. That's really, really cool. Like I've had quite a few clients telling me something like, oh yeah, and that friend came to me, or I was at that retreat, at that like transformational retreat, and I was like, and I find myself holding space the way you hold space for me, and I just wanted to thank you for that. And I'm like, I guess, yes,
Yeah.
you really get it. I can see that.
Yeah.
It just makes me so happy. Yeah.
It's the work, the methodology and action. And it's incredible to see people taking that and spreading it, because I think what I've learned about relational wellness is at the end of the day, it's all communication. And as much as it's not rocket science, we are never taught how to communicate, period, but how to communicate our more intense feelings, how to communicate things like grief or fear or anxieties that, and also I love what you said about it's about making a request rather than a demand, and kind of teaching people how to be open and clear, as simple as those two words are. And it's just really, I think we as a whole, as a people, don't have those skill sets. It's not taught in school. And we may learn some things, some amazing, beautiful things from our family structures and our community structures. But as a lesson, as a life skill, it's not honed in until I think a lot of people find therapy and modalities which prioritize community and knowing oneself, and then how to take that information and share it and distill it with another person. And even to the like, hey, it might not be the best time to request that like while you're having sex. It might be better to request that, over coffee in the morning, or talk about some of these subject matters, like framing the conditions so that the communication is heard. Right. So how do you work with clients who may struggle with shame or guilt around sex or sexuality? And I guess more specifically, maybe if it's manifesting in physically. So, they maybe are experiencing erectile dysfunction. So a more specific struggle for a lot of men is erectile dysfunction, and that can be physiological, psychological, so many factors into that condition. So with that, when they're struggling with shame and guilt around their sex or sex life, and then it's now causing erectile dysfunction.
So again, it's a combination of many different things, right? In the work we do in sessions together, it's a lot of using those emotions or those situations as a trailhead to explore what might be underneath, right? Understand what part of them might be blocking their body from reacting the way other parts of them want in that moment. And so that way they're already building a relationship, a different kind of relationship with those emotions, and they're already building different muscles to relate with what's happening inside of them. And just doing that in the moment when they're with a partner, they start noticing the guilt, checking in with the guilt, the way we learn how to do in our sessions is just one more tool they already have available. And also the way I accompany people, I've been told my guidance is very somatic. Because IFS, the way I do it, it can look like coaching or like talk therapy could look, right? But with clients who have the ability to go inside and close their eyes, it starts looking like guided meditation, or people end up seeing a lot of things anyway.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it's really a way to explore your inner world and be with your inner world. And so they just develop more body awareness, sensation awareness. And so I get that in a very somatic way, as I've been told. So all of that is all of the little things we do in session are as many things they have in the moment. And I also give same extra little things they can try. And everybody's different. Some will work better for some people than others, right? Like if you're with a partner, coming back to the breath, your own breath, coming back to the sensation in your own body, kind of like very simple mindfulness exercises. And I tell them, and you do that over and over and over again, right? 10 seconds later, you might be lost in your head again. Just come back to the sensation or come back to your own breath, right? So all of that is around like the inner reactions in the moment, right? Then there's a lot of education simply around, explaining that sex is much more than intercourse and inviting them to realize how much their perception of how it should look like or what their body is supposed to be doing is just conditioning, like stories that we tell, right?
Yeah, it's fantasy.
Yeah, and also how much, and also educating on like stats. I don't remember right now, but like genital non-concordance. Genital non-concordance. So when you have a genital response that doesn't match your emotional state or physiological state, like you feel aroused, you really want to have sex, but if you're a penis owner, you're not getting erect, for instance. Or vice versa, you absolutely don't want that, and suddenly you have an erection.
Okay.
That's called genital concordance in French, but I can't say it in English. So.
Non-concordance.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, so those little things on how to be in the moment. And that includes, as I was saying, some extra recipes around like breathing and stuff like that. General education on typical body responses, etc. And then 3, in those sessions together, like diving deep into where that comes from them. And very often you find traumatic or pseudo-traumatic events in the sense of having been shamed by a partner or having been shamed by a caregiver or things like that. And so having internalized a lot of fear or shame or guilt around the natural responses of their body. Sometimes it's around the fact of being erect or not that this happened. Sometimes it's around emotional closeness itself that this happened. And then we just spend a lot of time with that, the time that it needs to heal. Yeah.
And then, so my second question, or a question that comes from this conversation, is how do you coach them on communicating with their partners? Because there is on the other end, so you're predominantly working one-on-one and not with couples, but on the other end is another person who is experiencing maybe insecurity, or like they're in bed, they're doing foreplay, and then their partner can't get hard and they're like, they're not attracted to me. There's so much on the other end of your work. And so how do you communicate with your clientele to then communicate with their partner of how to, support coming back to their breath? Or I guess, how do you coach them to coach their partner through this process and feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable about those conversations? Because I think it starts happening where it's like shame, and then it starts dividing the couple, or, things start happening.
So I will say that, though, that it's not necessarily the case for everybody. In practice, the clients I work with are often more affected by it than their partners are in the moment. Their partner starts having, in what I've seen with some clients, partners start having issue when it's recurring and long term. But then it's more around, I don't feel close to my partner anymore. And so in practice, it's simply, and back to the communication example I talked about earlier and what you said, talking about those things, not in bed, ideally, sharing vulnerably. I would tell my client to share what all of that represents for them. And I would not tell them to share. I would invite them to share as much as they feel comfortable about the type of emotion that is bringing up for them. As we were talking about making requests for this to be a joint team effort in tackling that problem that the relationship has right now, which is that they're not able to connect sexually the way they wish. And then in terms of strategies, there's many things that they can do, from the kind of emotional support or presence that the client might need from their partner if they have to come back to their breath, or things like that, around creativity together, around other activities that they could be doing, around my client supporting the other person too. What type of emotional support or physical support do they need as well? Because that's also affecting them if they're not getting the type of intimacy they might crave with a certain partner, right? And then I'm sure there's much more, and on a case basis, those things just come up on their own, but like that would be the start for sure. Also, very early on, I always tell people, that could be physiological, that could be psychological. I don't know. Talk to a doctor.
Yes.
And we can do everything else that I just said.
Exactly. Yeah. Investigate all routes.
Because, like always. Don't assume it's psychological.
Yeah.
There could be so many other things. Yeah. I just wanted to make that clear.
And oftentimes it is a combination of all the things, or it's like cart before the horse. The one thing led to the other, but now the body has created a system. It's like, this is how we function now. And it's about retraining that. And it can be both physiological and psychological at certain points. Thank you for adding that. And then, speaking of conversations, how do you approach conversations with your clients about consent? Because when we talked prior to this, you mentioned that that's a big part of some of your work is consent. And so what does that look like? How does that frame educating people on consent?
Yeah. So first, I try to really expand a tiny bit what they think consent might be. And I think a lot of people, and me included before I got into that work, kind of tend to equate consent with permission. But consent is much wider than that. Permission is a small part of consent. Consent is really the active process through which we make sure that everybody involved is constantly within their desires and boundaries. And I think already framing it as that is already showing you it's very often not clear cut, not super clear yes or no, which then means that we actually have to engage even more in checking in and in making sure that everybody is there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that grayness is an encouragement for more active engagement. So the first thing that I talk about, and the second thing I really try to drive home with everybody I talk to around this point, I truly believe that it's the responsibility of the people with more power. So that can be because of gender, social status, money, whatever else is at play in that particular relationship, to do the extra legwork and like make sure that consent is that everybody is able to consent fully and freely. So a little bit of like theoretical education on those things, and let me know if it's not clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, from what I'm understanding, it's no matter what a relationship is, there's always a dynamic. And so it could be a gender dynamic, age dynamic, power dynamic. One partner is working, the other is unemployed. There's so many different dynamics that develop even just between familial, parent, child, and consent and boundaries are important across all relationships. And so that's what I'm understanding. So is that clear? Like it's depending on the dynamic, you might encourage the person who might be more in the position of power.
Be the one checking in more often, for instance.
Yeah.
Not expecting the one to say no if they don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
Going, hey, do you feel like that?
Yeah.
Whether that's in bed or in a wider dynamic in your life or things like that.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing I talk about, to try to get them wrap their idea on what that is. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing I try to explain people, and cis men, two people, and cis men tend to really integrate that really, really fast often. I'm convinced that the specifically around sexuality now, I'm convinced that the reason why so many people might think consent ruined the mood, independently of their gender or sexual orientation, is just because they don't have models of how it can be practiced. And I think consent is as much a part of the game of seduction as how good a dancer you are or whether you give good massage. And so specifically now around cis men clients who are actively dating or looking for partners, again, usually that really drives home really fast.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, I can do that. And that solves all of those tensions that I had around I don't know how to initiate and still I care about consent and I want to do that well. And you tell me I can do both and everybody's going to love it.
Yeah.
Usually it's like, okay, cool. I'm going to learn how to do that now.
Yeah. I can speak for myself and a lot of women I know who appreciate that level of consent. Consent is the form of conversation. It's not necessarily like, I have this NDA, I have some paperwork for you to sign before we initiate sex here. It's as simple sometimes as like, what feels good? Just like you would say, I made you this pie. Does this taste good? And getting the, like, do you want pie? And the person says yes or no. They eat the pie. Do you like the pie? Is a continuation of that consent.
Exactly.
And then adding other things. Hey, you don't give them ice cream. All of a sudden you say, do you want ice cream? They might say yes to pie. They might not want the ice cream. So that's...
Can I share one tip that I give you? So one thing I really like is when you make a request, inviting the person making the request to separate the expression of their desire from the question. And then when they ask the question, ask an open question. So how does this sound like? Instead of saying, do you like the pie? Do you want ice cream? I could say, hey, I saw that you like the pie. I also really want to give you ice cream. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I like that. I like the how do you feel about it too.
And so this is so cool for so many reasons, because first, on the safety side, like, and really having a built-in check-in. If I ask you, do you want ice cream? Right? You have this direct versus indirect communication problem. You're like, are you asking me? Is he really asking me if I want ice cream? Is he saying he wants to give me ice cream? Like, there's just so much loaded in that question.
Is this a trick question? Should I not have ice cream?
Yeah, like, there's just a lot there, right? And instead, if I'm very clear, hey, I want to give you an ice cream. How do you feel about that, right? So then it's very, very clear. And also going back to leading and acting first and things like that, stating the desire point blank is as bold a move as doing it right away, which used to be kind of the norm. Has a lot of problem built in around those power imbalances, especially, right? Because it's hard to say no if I were to just try to give you ice cream without saying anything.
Right.
But if I just say, hey, I really want to give you ice cream, that just keeps that same polarity and dynamic that some people really like, but giving you more space to maybe say no. And then instead of asking a yes/no question, which same can have a little bit of absolute in it, right? Because it's like, well, I don't want to offend him, so I don't want to say no, but
or you're just not sure
are you
yet.
sure yet? By asking you, how do you feel about it? So an open question that invites you to tune inside. And if you really want ice cream, it's actually going to be really hard because you're going to tune into how much you really crave ice cream right now.
Yeah.
Right? And so you're just going to say, you might be like, ooh, yeah.
I want ice cream.
Yeah.
Or you're like, maybe in a little bit.
Yeah.
But let's have more pie.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. I love that. Actually, that's really great information for all genders, all people engaging with one another around consent.
I used to teach a workshop around specific that. I called it sexy consent skills. I haven't taught in a while, but yeah.
I think we need it. We definitely need more workshops like that. That was really cool. Let's see what else we have. Okay, so how do you approach topics like polyamory, open relationship, non-monogamy?
With clients?
Yeah, like, do you have clients who come to you who are monogamous and they're looking for that, or maybe they're not even with somebody, but they're noticing like this is something that's drawn, like this type of style is for them and speaking to them more. So how do you approach or work with people who are trying to open up?
So I haven't worked with that many people who are trying to open up. Most of my clients are either mostly monogamous, sometimes curious about openness or polyamory, but mostly monogamous, or actively poly and been like that for years. So yeah, just in terms of the people I work with, I haven't had really to transition people by the hand onto the transition. So the people who are actively poly, like it's just a non-issue or a topic like any other. Of course, there's things that come up when we work together that are linked to the fact that they're poly, but it's not about that. These are the people in their lives. These are the dynamics in their lives. It's not interrogations around whether they want to do that or not. And for the people who are monogamous and curious about it, I mean, it's just a lot of the same as with anything else they bring up that they might be curious about, right? Helping them understand where that comes from for them, what's so important about it, potentially educating them on the topic as well, because or pointing them to our resources so that they can do that deeper work, learning more about what exists out there and all of that. And yeah, it's kind of a neutral, like it's a non-issue for most of my clients. Like it's not something that has charge around it. Yeah.
It's a neutral point.
Yeah.
It's either a fact about them or not. It's not anything that they're struggling with through that.
And I think that's just, I know a lot of people outside are just a fact about the people I've worked with. Yeah.
So if you're ready, can we come back to that question of what does masculinity mean to you?
The answer is it's definitely an open question. I think instead of trying to answer it, I should just share that. There's a lot of interrogations for me around what it means to be a man. And I can see parts of myself that are still attached to some social construct around. I can see that I'm still partly attached to a lot of ideals of what masculinity should look like. Things like presence, groundedness, being able to protect, support. Like, again, very stereotypical, very conditioned, right? But like, I can tell that those things are important to some parts of me. And at the same time, a lot of my own version of masculinity is actually built in rejection of other stereotypical societal ideas such as power, assertiveness, like strictness, assertiveness, imposing your will or your ideas onto others. So kind of there's those two groups of stereotypically masculine thing out there. Some parts of me are attached to, some parts of me are like rejecting actively, and kind of my constructions in between those two. And I am going through my own interrogations around gender, sexual orientations, relationship styles, and all of that. And it's really a question mark to me. So I really, if we do a follow-up in a couple of years, maybe I'll have more on that.
It's going to be a continued question probably for the remainder of your life. It's like, what does this mean to me? And it's a healthy way to look at it, like just continually questioning what masculinity means to you through your lifetime. So is there anything you think we missed or that we should talk about as we wrap up?
No, I think That's a pretty cool conversation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much. How can people find you?
The easiest is probably Instagram. Awake and Sexy is my handle. When I started the page, I don't. It doesn't resonate as much anymore. I'm thinking about a lot about changing it.
Yeah.
But at the time, my focus was really around consciousness, inner works, growth, spirituality on the one hand, hence the awake.
Yep.
And sexuality, intimacy on the other, and sexy. So at Awaken Sexy on Instagram is the best place, and then my website is awakensexy.com.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us. It was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Special thanks to all of our guests. Head South is hosted by Kat Meyer, produced by Isis Barlow, edited by Megan Hook, with music by Lily Rezi Rothman, graphics by Ella Chodos Irvine, cover art by Gina Ship Casey, and intro by Murph Meyer.
If you're looking for me, I'm heading south. All year round, I'm going down. Now you know where I'll be, I'm heading south. So come on, look me right in the mouth.